Daniel had helped her cross the street every morning for 3 months. The woman in the wheelchair who never spoke only nodded her thanks with eyes that lingered a second too long. He told himself it was kindness, the kind of small ritual that made him feel like a decent man again after everything he'd lost. But his 12-year-old daughter noticed something he hadn't, the way the woman's gaze wasn't grateful, but watchful, like someone studying a puzzle they'd been trying to solve for years. Then one morning, as he bent down to adjust the brake on her wheelchair, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. Her whisper was so soft, he almost missed it. "You don't remember me, do you?" The pharmacy parking lot suddenly felt too quiet, the morning sun too bright against the asphalt. He searched her face for recognition, anything, but found only a smile that didn't reach her eyes. What happened 8 years ago that he'd buried so deep, even his own memory had tried to forget? The morning routine had become as automatic as breathing for Daniel Fletcher. Wake at 5:30, shower, make breakfast for Sophie, pack her lunch, drop her at school by 7:15, then head to his shift at Morrison's Pharmacy on Maple Street. He'd been working the early morning stockroom for 6 years now, ever since the divorce left him scrambling to rebuild a life that felt stable enough for his daughter. The work was quiet, methodical, scanning inventory, shelving medications, occasionally helping customers who wandered in before the official opening. It wasn't the career he'd imagined at 25, but at 43, he'd learned that life rarely asked permission before rewriting your plans. The woman in the wheelchair first appeared on a Tuesday in late August. Daniel had just finished unloading a delivery truck when he saw her struggling at the curb outside the pharmacy, her wheels caught in a crack in the pavement. Without thinking, he jogged over and freed the chair, then helped her navigate across the intersection to the bus stop on the other side. She looked young, probably early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a face that would have been striking if not for the exhaustion carved into every line. Her legs lay motionless beneath a faded denim jacket draped across her lap like a blanket. She didn't speak, just nodded once, and Daniel went back to work thinking nothing of it. But she was there again the next morning, and the morning after that. By the second week, Daniel found himself watching for her, not consciously at first, just a peripheral awareness that around 6:45, she'd appear at that same curb. He'd step outside, help her across, exchange the same silent nod, and return to his duties. His co-workers teased him about his morning ritual, but Daniel brushed it off. What else was he supposed to do? Leave her stranded? Still, something about her stayed with him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was her age. She was so young to be in a wheelchair, too young to have that kind of weariness in her eyes. Or maybe it was the way she never smiled, never made small talk, just accepted his help with a kind of resigned patience that felt heavier than gratitude should feel. Sophie noticed before he did that something was off. They were having dinner one Thursday evening, spaghetti from a jar, garlic bread from the freezer, when she set down her fork and said, "Dad, why does that lady stare at you like that?" Daniel had been scrolling through his phone, barely listening. "What lady?" Sophie took a deliberate bite, chewing slowly the way she did when she wanted to seem casual about something that bothered her. "The one you help every morning. I saw her yesterday when you dropped me off. She was watching you from across the street. Like, really watching you. Not the normal way people look at someone." Daniel felt something cold slide down his spine, but he forced a laugh. "You've been watching too many mystery shows. She's just grateful, that's all." Sophie shrugged. But her eyes held that skeptical look she'd inherited from her mother, the look that said she knew when adults were lying to themselves. That night, Daniel lay awake longer than usual, replaying his interactions with the woman. Had there been something strange in her gaze? He tried to picture her face clearly but found he couldn't. She'd become a fixture, like the stop sign on the corner, or the faded awning of the bakery next door. Present, but not really seen. Except now that Sophie had pointed it out, Daniel couldn't unsee it. The way the woman's hands gripped the wheels of her chair, knuckles white with tension. The way she held herself rigid even when he was helping her, as if she didn't trust him, despite accepting his assistance every single day. The next morning, Daniel paid closer attention. When he approached her wheelchair, he noticed things he'd somehow missed before. The chair itself was relatively new, the kind covered partially by insurance, but still expensive enough to suggest she hadn't been in it for very long. Her clothes were clean, but worn. Jeans with frayed hems, a gray hoodie that had seen better days, sneakers that looked barely used because she'd never need to walk in them. But her hands, gripping the wheels as she tried to maneuver forward, weren't the hands of someone who'd spent years in a wheelchair. They were strong, but unscarred by the calluses that came from years of self-propulsion. These were the hands of someone still learning, still adjusting, still angry about having to adjust at all. "Beautiful morning," Daniel said, trying to break the silence that had stretched across 3 months of these encounters. The woman tilted her head slightly but didn't respond. He could feel her attention on him, even though she was facing forward, could sense the weight of eyes on the side of his face. The light changed. He pushed her across the intersection, the wheels clicking over the painted lines, and deposited her at the far curb. She nodded as always, and Daniel turned to go. He'd made it 3 steps when he heard it, a sound so soft it could have been the wind, except there was no wind that morning. "Thank you, Daniel." He froze, turned back. The woman was already wheeling herself down the sidewalk toward the bus stop, her back to him, moving with surprising speed for someone who'd seemed so helpless moments before. Daniel stood at the edge of the crosswalk, heart hammering, cars honking as the light changed again. She knew his name. But he'd never told her his name. He never wore a name tag. Morrison's didn't require them for stockroom workers. So how did she know? The question followed him through the rest of his shift, circling his thoughts like a persistent fly. Maybe someone at the pharmacy had mentioned his name within earshot. Maybe she'd overheard Sophie calling him Dad one morning and later asked around. Maple Street was a small commercial district. People talked. There had to be a logical explanation. But that night, after putting Sophie to bed, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He dug out the old cardboard box from the top shelf of his closet, the one labeled Legal 2015 in his ex-wife's neat handwriting, and started going through the contents. Court documents from the divorce, bank statements, old bills, and beneath all of that, a folder he'd almost forgotten existed, stuffed with papers from an incident he'd spent 8 years trying to erase from his memory. His hands trembled as he opened it. The pages yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but still legible. Police reports, insurance documents, legal correspondence, and at the bottom, a newspaper clipping he didn't remember saving. The headline stark in bold print. Local dance student's career, Densor, ends in highway collision. The accident happened on a Saturday night in late March 2016. Daniel had been 35, working as a delivery driver for a furniture company to make ends meet, while his marriage crumbled and his debt piled higher. He'd just finished his last drop-off of the day, a sectional sofa to a house in the suburbs, and was heading back to the warehouse when he saw the truck. A semi, weaving slightly between lanes on the highway, its trailer drifting over the center line. Daniel had been 3 cars back, watching it happen as if in slow motion. The truck jerked right, overcorrected left, and then jackknifed across both lanes. The car directly in front of the truck, a small silver sedan, had nowhere to go. The impact was thunderous, metal screaming against metal, and then everything went silent, except for the hiss of a radiator and the tick, tick, tick of a dying engine. Daniel had pulled over with a dozen other drivers. Someone was already calling 911. Someone else ran toward the wreckage with a fire extinguisher. Daniel approached the sedan, which had been crushed against the guardrail, its hood folded like an accordion. The driver's side was too mangled to see inside, but he could make out movement in the passenger seat. A young woman, maybe early 20s, her face pale with shock, blood streaming from a gash on her forehead. She was trying to speak, trying to point at something in the back seat, but Daniel couldn't understand. Later, he'd learned she'd been pointing at her dance bag, at the acceptance letter to a prestigious company in New York that she'd just received that morning, at the future that was being crushed along with her legs beneath the dashboard. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. By the time they extracted her from the vehicle, her legs were pinned beneath the dashboard, twisted at angles that made Daniel's stomach turn. The paramedics worked with urgent efficiency, but Daniel could see it in their faces. The girl in the sedan would never walk again. He'd given a brief statement to the police. Yes, he'd seen the truck lose control. No, he hadn't seen the sedan do anything wrong. And then he'd gone home and tried to forget. Tried to scrub the image of those twisted legs from his mind. Tried to unhear the sound of her screaming as they pulled her free. For 2 weeks, he almost succeeded. But then the calls started. A lawyer representing the trucking company wanted to interview him. They were building a case, they said, trying to determine liability. Daniel told them what he'd told the police. The truck had caused the accident. The sedan was innocent. But the lawyer kept calling, kept pressing, kept hinting that maybe Daniel hadn't seen things as clearly as he thought. Maybe the sedan had been speeding. Maybe it had changed lanes suddenly. Maybe the young driver had been distracted, texting, not paying attention. Maybe. And then the offers started. Small at first, $200 for his time and inconvenience if he'd just review his statement and consider whether he might have been mistaken about certain details. Then $500, then $1,000. Daniel was drowning. His wife had just filed for divorce. He was 3 months behind on rent. His credit cards were maxed out. He'd been eating ramen and peanut butter for weeks because he couldn't afford real groceries. The $1,000 felt like a life raft in an ocean that was determined to pull him under. He told himself it was just a minor adjustment. He'd been 3 cars back. Maybe he hadn't seen the sedan's speed as clearly as he'd first thought. Maybe it had been going faster than the limit. Maybe that contributed to the driver's inability to avoid the collision. It was still the truck's fault, primarily, but if the sedan bore even 15% of the blame, the settlement numbers would shift. The insurance companies would split the cost. The trucking company would pay less. And the girl, well, she'd still get compensation. Just not as much. So Daniel signed the revised statement. He took the money. He paid his rent. He bought groceries. He convinced himself that he hadn't really lied. Just adjusted his recollection. That it was a victimless crime because the girl would still be taken care of, just differently. That he'd had no choice. That anyone in his position would have done the same thing. And then he buried the folder at the bottom of his closet and never looked at it again. He didn't read the follow-up articles about how the reduced settlement had left the dancer, Grace Hollis, her name was Grace Hollis, unable to afford the long-term care she needed. Didn't read about how she'd lost her scholarship, her apartment, her spot in the New York company. Didn't read about how she'd spent 2 years in a rehabilitation facility and then been released with a wheelchair and a voucher for subsidized housing and nothing else. Daniel closed the folder, his hands shaking. The newspaper clipping fluttered to the floor, a photo of Grace Hollis at 22, standing on point in a dance studio, her whole life ahead of her. He picked it up with numb fingers and stared at the face in the photograph. Then he pulled up the image in his mind of the woman he'd been helping every morning for 3 months. Same dark hair, same sharp cheekbones, same eyes, though they'd been bright with ambition in the photo and were now flat with something that looked like patience, a terrible, watchful patience. It was her. The dancer whose career he'd helped destroy. The girl whose legs had been crushed while he'd stood by and watched. and she'd been waiting at that curb every morning for 3 months, letting him help her, letting him feel like a good person, all while knowing exactly what he'd done. The next morning, Daniel almost didn't go outside when he saw her at the curb. He stood in the pharmacy stockroom, watching through the window as she struggled to navigate up onto the sidewalk, her wheels slipping on the concrete lip. Every instinct told him to stay inside, to pretend he hadn't noticed, to let someone else help her. But he knew, with a sick certainty, that she would wait. She would sit there every morning until he came out, because whatever this was, whatever confrontation or revenge or reckoning she had planned, it required his participation. So he pushed through the door and walked toward her, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. She didn't look up as he approached, didn't acknowledge him until he reached for the handles of her chair. Then she spoke, still staring straight ahead. "Do you ever think about that night, Daniel?" Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. Daniel's hands froze on the chair. His throat felt tight, his tongue thick. "I don't know what you're talking about." She made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Of course you don't. People like you never do. It's easier that way, isn't it? To just forget. To tell yourself it didn't really matter. To cash the check and move on." The street around them seemed to blur, the morning sounds fading into white noise. Daniel's mouth was dry, his heart slamming against his ribs. "Who are you?" The woman finally turned her head, and Daniel saw her face clearly for the first time. Not just the surface, but the grief and rage and exhaustion carved into every feature. "My name is Grace Hollis," she said quietly. 8 years ago, I was 22 years old. Driving home from the dance studio where I'd just been accepted into the New York City Ballet's trainee program, a semi-truck jackknifed in front of me. I spent 11 months in the hospital, lost my scholarship, lost my career, lost the ability to ever dance again, to ever walk again, because a man named Daniel Fletcher told a courtroom that maybe I'd been speeding, that maybe I was partially responsible for what happened to me. Daniel felt the ground tilt beneath him. I didn't. I never testified in court. It was just a statement. Grace's smile was bitter. Your statement was entered into evidence. Same effect. The insurance company used it to reduce my settlement by 65%. 65%, Daniel. Do you know what that meant for someone like me? I was 22. I had nothing. No family money, no trust fund. Just a scholarship and a dream and a body that could do incredible things. Your statement, your lie, meant the difference between getting the care I needed to maybe regain some function in my legs and spending the rest of my life like this. She gestured at herself, at the wheelchair, at the worn clothes, and the exhaustion that seemed to seep from her pores. I've been homeless twice. I've slept in shelters. I've gone days without eating because I had to choose between food and the medications that keep the nerve pain from driving me insane. All because you needed rent money. The light changed. Cars began to honk. Grace turned her chair away from him, beginning to wheel herself across the intersection alone. Daniel stood paralyzed, watching her navigate the crosswalk with the same careful determination he'd witnessed every morning for 3 months, and suddenly he understood. She hadn't needed his help. Not once. She'd been testing him, watching him, waiting to see if he'd recognize her, if any flicker of memory or guilt would surface. And he'd failed the test every single day. He'd looked at her and seen a charity case, a good deed, an opportunity to feel better about himself. He'd never once seen her as a person he'd wronged. That evening, Sophie found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "Dad, are you okay?" Daniel looked at his daughter, 12 years old, still young enough to believe her father was a good man, still innocent enough to think the world made sense. How did you explain to your child that you destroyed someone's life? That you'd chosen your own survival over another person's future? That the man she thought he was didn't really exist? Sophie, he said slowly, if you found out someone you trusted had done something really bad a long time ago, would you still love them? Sophie frowned, puzzled by the question. Like, how bad? Daniel struggled to find words that wouldn't shatter her. Bad enough that someone else's whole life was ruined because of it. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, her face serious, in a way that made her seem older than her years. Then she said, very carefully, I think I'd want them to fix it, if they could. And if they couldn't fix it, I'd want them to at least try to make it right. Because that's what good people do when they mess up. They don't just say, sorry. They actually do something. She paused, studying his face with uncomfortable perception. Did you do something bad, Dad? Daniel wanted to lie, wanted to protect her from this, from him, from the knowledge that her father was capable of such casual cruelty. But he thought about Grace's face that morning, about the 8 years she'd spent paying for his cowardice, and he couldn't do it. Yes, he said quietly, I did something very bad, and I think it's time I tried to fix it. The next morning, Daniel didn't wait for Grace at the curb. Instead, he walked 3 blocks to the bus stop where she spent her days, a cardboard sign propped against her wheelchair that read, Anything helps. She saw him coming, and her expression hardened, her hands tightening on the wheels, as if preparing to flee. But Daniel spoke before she could move. I'm not here to make excuses, he said. His voice rough with the words he'd rehearsed all night, but that still felt inadequate. I'm here to tell you that you're right, about all of it. I lied. I knew the accident wasn't your fault, and I lied anyway, because I needed the money, and I convinced myself it wouldn't really matter, that you'd still get enough to be okay. I didn't think about what I was taking from you. I didn't think about you at all, really. You were just an abstract, a case number. And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back what I helped take away. But I'm sorry. Grace stared at him for a long, measured moment. The morning light caught the silver in her dark hair. Too much silver for 30 years old, the kind that came from stress and pain, and nights spent wondering how you'd survive another day. Why now? She asked finally. Why not 8 years ago? Why not when it would have actually mattered? Daniel shook his head helplessly. Because I'm a coward. Because I spent 8 years telling myself that what I did wasn't really that bad, that anyone would have done the same thing. Because my daughter asked me a question last night that I couldn't answer, and I realized that if I don't do this now, I'll never be able to look at her without seeing my own shame reflected back. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out with a trembling hand. This is a signed affidavit, a full recantation of my original statement. I contacted a lawyer yesterday. He says it probably won't reopen your case completely, but it might be enough to file an appeal for additional compensation. The trucking company settled with several other victims from accidents around the same time, and there's evidence they were systematically pressuring witnesses. If we can prove a pattern of fraud, you might have a chance. And if you want me to, I'll testify in person. I'll stand in front of a judge and tell them exactly what I did, and why. I'll go on the record. I'll risk perjury charges, whatever it takes. Grace took the envelope with hands that shook slightly. She opened it slowly, pulled out the pages, scanned the contents with an expression Daniel couldn't read. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. You realize this could destroy your life, she said softly. Your job, your reputation. People will know what you did. Your daughter will know. Daniel nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the terror that had been clawing at him since last night. I know, but she already asked me if I'd done something bad, and I'd rather she see me own my mistakes and face the consequences than spend the rest of her life wondering if her father's a coward, who only does the right thing when it's convenient. For the first time in 3 months, Grace's expression softened slightly. Not forgiveness. It was too soon for that. Might always be too soon for that. But something that looked like recognition. Like she was seeing him as a person, rather than just the man who'd wronged her. "I spent 8 years imagining this moment," she said quietly. "Thinking about what I'd say if I ever got the chance to confront you. I had whole speeches planned. I was going to make you feel every bit of pain you'd caused me. I was going to watch you squirm." She folded the affidavit carefully, tucked it into a canvas bag hanging from her wheelchair. "But now that it's happening, I just feel tired. So tired of carrying this rage around. It's been eating me alive for 8 years, and I don't think I have room for it anymore." Daniel sat down on the bench beside her wheelchair, suddenly exhausted. "What does it feel like?" he asked. "Now that you've confronted me?" Grace was quiet for a moment, watching the morning commuters hurry past, everyone rushing toward their own urgencies, their own small dramas, oblivious to the quiet reckoning happening on a street corner in the early light. "Like maybe," she said finally. "Maybe we both get to stop carrying this alone now. It doesn't fix anything. Doesn't give me back my legs or my career or the last 8 years. But at least now the truth is out there. At least now you have to live with it too." The legal process took 9 months. Daniel's affidavit, combined with testimony from 2 other witnesses who'd also been pressured by the trucking company's lawyers, was enough to trigger a federal investigation into witness tampering. The case attracted media attention, local at first, then picked up by larger outlets interested in stories about corporate malfeasance and the failures of the insurance system. Daniel gave interviews, told his story, explained his choices without trying to justify them. He lost his job at Morrison's Pharmacy when the story went public, but he also received an unexpected email from a victims' rights organization offering him a position as a community outreach coordinator. They wanted someone who understood, from personal experience, how easy it was to make the wrong choice under pressure. Someone who could talk to people about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Grace received a settlement that, while it couldn't undo the damage, at least provided security. Enough for better medical care, a small apartment with accessibility features, a modified van so she could regain some independence. Enough to enroll in online classes and start working toward the degree she'd abandoned 8 years ago. Not dance, that door was closed forever, but arts administration. A way to stay connected to the world she'd lost while building something new. They didn't become friends. The wound was too deep for that, the history too complicated. But they developed something else, a mutual understanding, perhaps, or a shared acknowledgement that people were messy and complicated and capable of both tremendous harm and genuine change. Sometimes Daniel would see Grace around the neighborhood, and they'd exchange brief nods, careful acknowledgments of each other's existence. Once, in the grocery store, she offered him advice about which brand of pasta was better. Small interactions, mundane and careful, that slowly built something that wasn't friendship, but wasn't enmity either. Sophie asked him one night, nearly a year after that first confrontation, if he regretted telling the truth. They were washing dishes side by side in their cramped apartment kitchen, the window open to let in the cool evening air. Daniel thought about it, really thought about it, weighing the cost against the alternative. "I regret what I did 8 years ago," he said finally. "I regret being so desperate that I convinced myself it was okay to destroy someone else's life to save my own. But telling the truth, taking responsibility, that's the first thing I've done in a long time that I'm actually proud of." Sophie bumped her shoulder against his, soap suds flying. "Me too, Dad. I'm proud of you too." On a morning in late April, nearly a year and a half after that first whispered confrontation in the pharmacy parking lot, Daniel saw Grace outside a coffee shop near the university campus. She was at a table with a laptop open, papers spread around her, completely absorbed in whatever she was working on. Daniel almost kept walking. They'd established their boundaries, their careful distance, but then she looked up and saw him. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the sidewalk. Then Grace raised her hand in a small wave. Daniel hesitated, then walked over. "School project?" he asked, nodding at the papers. Grace smiled slightly. "Master's thesis proposal. Arts administration with a focus on accessibility and performance spaces." There was something different about her now. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of forward momentum that hadn't been there before. A sense that she was building towards something rather than just surviving. "That sounds amazing," Daniel said, and meant it. Grace nodded, then gestured at the empty chair across from her. "Do you have a minute?" Daniel sat, uncertain what this conversation would become, but willing to find out. They talked for almost an hour. Careful at first, circling around the history between them, then gradually more natural. Grace told him about her classes, about the research she was doing on how performance venues could be redesigned to accommodate disabled dancers and audience members. Daniel told her about his work at the Victims' Rights Organization, about the people he met who were struggling with similar choices he'd once faced. They didn't talk about forgiveness. That word still felt too large, too loaded. But they talked about moving forward, about the strange reality that the worst moments of your life could somehow become the foundation for building something better. As Daniel stood to leave, Grace caught his hand briefly. "I still don't forgive you," she said quietly. "I don't know if I ever will. What you did cost me 8 years of my life. And I can't just erase that." She paused, holding his gaze. "But I also don't hate you anymore. And I think that matters. I think that's worth something." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he managed, "for giving me the chance to make it right, even though it was 8 years too late. For not just destroying me when you had every right to." Grace's smile was sad, but genuine. "Destroying you wouldn't have given me my legs back, wouldn't have made me feel better. I learned that the hard way. But watching you actually try to fix what you broke, that helped. Not completely, not enough, but it helped." They parted ways then, Grace wheeling back toward campus, Daniel heading home to make dinner before Sophie got back from school. He thought about her words as he walked, turning them over in his mind like smooth stones. She didn't forgive him, but she didn't hate him anymore either. It wasn't redemption. That was too neat, too simple for something as complicated as what they'd been through. But it was something, a small mercy in a world that rarely offered second chances. A reminder that the hardest conversations were often the ones that set you free. That night, Sophie worked on homework at the kitchen table while Daniel cooked. She was writing an essay about moral courage for her English class, and she kept asking him questions about what it meant to do the right thing when it was scary. Daniel answered as honestly as he could, drawing on his own failures and the long road back from them. When Sophie finally finished her essay and read it aloud, a piece about how real courage meant admitting your mistakes, even when the consequences were terrible, Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he said when she finished. Sophie shrugged, embarrassed, but pleased. "I just wrote about you, Dad, about what you did." Daniel pulled her into a hug, holding on tighter than necessary. "You know I'm not a hero, right? What I did 8 years ago was terrible. I hurt someone badly because I was scared and selfish." Sophie pulled back to look at him seriously. "I know. But you fixed it when you could have just kept hiding. That's what makes you brave. Not that you never messed up, that you made it right even though it was hard." In the years that followed, Daniel would sometimes think about that morning in the pharmacy parking lot when Grace had gripped his wrist and whispered those terrible words. "You don't remember me, do you?" He would remember the shock of recognition, the sick understanding of what he'd done and what it had cost her. But he would also remember the morning at the coffee shop when she'd told him she didn't hate him anymore, when she'd offered him not forgiveness, but something almost as valuable: the acknowledgement that people could change, could face their worst selves, and choose to become better. It wasn't a happy ending. Grace would never dance again, would never get back the 8 years she'd lost. Daniel would never fully escape the guilt of what he'd done, the knowledge that his cowardice had destroyed someone's dreams. But it was an honest ending, a true ending. And in a world that often traded in comforting lies, truth felt like the only thing worth holding on to. He'd taught Sophie that much, at least, that courage wasn't about never being afraid or never making mistakes. It was about facing the people you'd harmed, owning what you'd done, and building something honest from the ruins of what you'd broken. It was about being seen in your worst moment and choosing, somehow, to still keep trying to be better. And on mornings when Daniel dropped Sophie at school, when he watched her walk through those double doors with her backpack and her confidence and her unshakable belief that people could change, he thought maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of them got. The chance to stop running from our ghosts, to face the damage we'd caused, and to spend whatever time we had left trying to leave things a little better than we found them. Grace had given him that chance, had let him see himself clearly in all his weakness and selfishness, and then had given him space to try to become someone different. Someone who could look his daughter in the eye and teach her that the truth, no matter how painful, was always better than a comfortable lie,